Bentley here. Good evening to you. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I welcome you to A Climate of Change, our live cast feature exploring with thought leaders from across Canada what these wildly unprecedented times mean for addressing the climate crisis here in Alberta and how to create the impactful change we need. In the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Blackfoot Confederacy, Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, the Tsuut'ina, the Yaqsi Nakota Nations, the Métis Nations of Region 3, and all people who make their homes in the Treaty 7 region of Southern Alberta. I'd like to also make a second land acknowledgement on behalf of another group of folks that have a stake in this land and that we stand on today, and that is our children, our nieces and nephews and grandchildren, and all future generations. I urge you to keep them in mind during this time as we face unprecedented change and start making decisions about what comes next. Our guest tonight is Jason Ribeiro, former Director of Strategy for Calgary Economic Development and outgoing Curator for Global Shapers Calgary. As we head into the City of Calgary's Climate Symposium 1 month from now, as well as at least one and possibly two elections over the next year, what better time to talk to somebody that understands strategy, knows this city, and realizes a transition is coming whether we like it or not. Jason Ribeiro, welcome to A Climate of Change.
Thanks, Bentley. Appreciate the invitation and all the work that the Calgary Climate Hub has done over the years. And we've partnered on events in the past through Global Shapers Calgary. So appreciate the partnership and appreciate the invitation.
Right on. Okay, so one of the things we like to do on this show is pan back and try to make sure that we're seeing some of the large global events through the proper climate lens that the moment requires. What I like to ask is, when that first lockdown came, there was a lot of people that were just in their own space and looking out the window and couldn't go anywhere and couldn't see people, at least in physically. What sort of moment, what do you think the teachable moment is from that time for specifically Calgarians?
It's a good question. And I've enjoyed hearing some of your previous guests tackle it in episodes past. Before I can even get to lessons learned, because there are several, I'm sure we'll get into a few of them throughout the course of our conversation. I really think it's important we hone in on how unprecedented COVID-19 and the subsequent response, restrictions, and lockdowns have been. If you'll indulge me for a moment, we're approaching the 1 year mark on March 15th of the declaration of the state of local emergency here in Calgary due to the pandemic. And while so many of the features of bubble life have become kind of rote, including the Zoom we find ourselves in on tonight, we can't lose sight of just how historic this is. For folks that have lived in other countries or dealt with health crises before at a pandemic level, many of them might have experienced brief or sustained lockdowns. But in the Canadian context, this is really unrivaled and new. Anything remotely similar occurred in the First World War, Second World War, and briefly in 1970 during the October crisis in Montreal. Other than that, there's been nothing since. So that's not to say that we haven't seen different types of crises before. We've seen, fiscal crises that may have prepared us for some of this. In Alberta, we have, volatility and resiliency essentially coded into our DNA due to the up and down performance of our energy sector. We've seen natural disasters. Out of the 10 most costly Canadian natural disasters in history, 7 out of 10 have been in Alberta, and all 7 of them have been in the last decade. Right. But that experience that you talked about of being restricted or cooped up for our own safety, and for this long of a period of time is extraordinary. And while we've shown that after disaster or crises past that we can bounce back, that our can-do spirit, our ingenuity and resilience is unrelenting, I worry truly about how hardened these past crises may have made us. And I fear that some of our pick ourselves up mentality and dust our shoulders off, tough exterior, which is admirable and something that I definitely relate to, I worry sometimes that it may not allow us to connect some really important dots. That being first, if we were to just close our eyes for a second and sit with the pain of experiencing unrelenting unemployment or precarious work, or being restricted from leaving our homes to see loved ones who are ill or isolated, or the pain of mourning with nearly the families of nearly 1,900 Albertans who have died during this pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And if we took that time to sit and close our eyes and understood that it is likely that in our lifetimes we find ourselves right back here in our homes in lockdown as a near certainty, and B, that it may be due to another health crisis, certainly, but it also may be very well due to a climate-related crisis. If we could acknowledge that possibility and potentially that reality, I fundamentally we would believe we'd be having a more fruitful, engaging, and productive dialogue. You know, we could think about a climate-related lockdown which forced governments to restrict private vehicles or individual or industrial CO2 emitting practices, not just limit or draw them down, but ban them outright. You know, we think that we're deploying a lot of fiscal horsepower now. Imagine what we would need to deploy later on in a climate-related lockdown. So for me, this is no longer theoretical. The evidence is in the ashes of people's homes in California, in frozen pipes in Texas, in dented vehicles in Northeast Calgary. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yes, I've seen some lessons learned, some teachable moments, but I'm worried still about whether we're employing all of the knowledge, all of the creativity, and the credibility that we desperately need to show that we can learn our way forward through this crisis and not let our response to this one or the next one or the one after that be more of the same or just, you know, the equivalent of playing Groundhog Day on loop. So I'll leave it there as sort of my overview of what the teachable moment and lessons learned have been.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned Texas, and you know, I started asking the question specifically about COVID, but when the insurrection happened on January 6th, I see things through a climate lens, so I can relate how that happened to climate. And then, you know, things like the Texas grid, I think something's happening there that, like, nobody's really talking about the fact that during the COVID pandemic, that disaster happened. And so, you know, it's like the new normal is whatever else happens in the world, from insurrections to pandemics to energy grids failing, you've always got this background of climate crisis. And, you know, so that requires a lot of resilience from a city and its people. And I think you're right to be concerned about that. I guess, you know, with you being, you have a really meaty title, you know, former director of strategy for Calgary Economic Development. To me, that's a decent title to be able to carry around in your life, and so kudos for that. But let me put you on the spot here and say that you know, you walk into a room, Trudeau's there, the head of the province is there, our mayor's there, and they say, Jason, you're a strategic director. What do you think our strategy should be for the next 10 years to sort of get through this pandemic and to address some of these global challenges that the whole world is staring down?
You're putting me in the driver's seat here. You know, careful what you wish for. Yeah. No, I appreciate those kind words. Look, you know, why don't I start with the sort of lay of the land that would sort of broach that conversation with those decision makers, and then kind of outline the perspective I hold that would shape those recommendations, and then we can see how the specific recommendations play out. You know, the first thing, and I think you've acknowledged it in the framing of the question, is we have to recognize that this simply can't be done, and by this I mean a sort of just transition, a just recovery, navigating a climate and public health crisis at the same time, as well with a number of other crises, an affordable housing crisis, a homelessness challenge, the reckoning on racial inequities that we've been facing. So in my opinion, many of these can't be done simply at a city level. We have too many people, particularly when we think about a just transition or a just recovery, we have too many people on the servicing and downstream side in our city, and our efforts would be disconnected from the efforts of those working upstream or on rigs in extraction elsewhere in Alberta. You know, furthermore, the city doesn't have, you know, the authority or fiscal horsepower to pull this off. So anything related to recovery, to transition, et cetera, would need to be approached across all three orders of government, as you alluded to, and I think that's really important. I also want to acknowledge, because it was implicit in the portion you discussed about Texas, is that we're in a similar position. Our economic recovery right now is uneven and uncertain because of the double whammy of the pandemic and low commodity prices. And that's over top of a layer of sustained joblessness and economic downturn over a number of years. So, the first challenge that we have to confront is that in an environment like that, it's not surprising to me that many are skeptical about some of the proposed solutions or responses to climate change or public health. Or the notion of transitioning our economy, or even some of the rhetoric that's emerging from other parts of the world about our province. And I think that's confirmed by most of the polling I've seen in Alberta and jurisdictions like it, particularly in Atlantic Canada. So I want to just acknowledge that I see a through line there. I understand it to a degree, and I think it's important to acknowledge. Now, the perspectives that would shape my opinion going into that room, first of all, I'm flattered that I've been given in some weird scenario that kind of authority. There's so many other people that are much smarter than me that I'm interested in. Dr. Blake Schaefer, Martha Hall Finley, so many others that I think you should have on this program. But I digress. I'm in the driver's seat. The first is, I'm walking in with lived experience. I grew up in a General Motors family with both my parents employed on the service side of the automotive industry in Ontario. Both were immigrants. Both had very little formally recognized education. Both went on to be quite successful. But I still remember the very visceral feeling of fear, of trepidation, of anger, and hastened planning that enveloped our home in 2009 when GM filed for Chapter 11. So I have a deep amount of compassion for people whose jobs and livelihoods are at the forefront of this conversation. The second one is more of a philosophical approach, which is that it's actually articulated really well in a book that I'll plug because it's thought-provoking, called Gardeners versus Designers. And it's written by Dr. Brian Lee Crowley, who's the head of the Macdonald Laurier Institute. And he's a right-leaning economist. And he said that, there are two types of buckets of political leaders. Ones that are designers who think that they can fix things from on high, on top down, and others that recognize just how far we've built this country, built this world with ingenuity and innovation, recognizing that there are things that need to be improved, but abandoning it to build something entirely new is oftentimes a little bit hubristic. And we have to be very cautious of over-promising and under-delivering. And so, his approach is one of less of a designer, but more of a gardener. And I think I adopt that approach. I don't think he brings it all the way home in that book. I disagree vehemently with a lot of the book, but I think that gardener versus designer mentality is really, really important. So I'm in the room now. The first thing that I think we need to do is draw from lessons from the past. And that's more the gardener's approach, taking the incremental sort of tweaked based approach of what's worked. And I think we have a lot to learn from the task force on just transition for Canadian coal power workers and communities. Federally commissioned body, has delivered some thoughtful reports, has led to a number of investments from the federal government, leveraged from other orders of government and the private sector. I think that's really important. So the three lessons I learned from that and others around the world are: number one, you have to consult. If you're embarking on some 10-year vision to do anything, you have to meaningfully consult with people. I have yet to see both upstream and downstream, as it concerns the just transition or a just recovery, the kind of consultation we need to really be able to have that conversation meaningfully about any policy that would need to be deployed. Secondly, I really think that we have to think about who is having that conversation. Oftentimes when it's approached particularly from a partisan lens, you only get so far. So having a commission that has representation from across the board, I think is supremely important. And third, we have to recognize that this is going to take capital. If this is about well wishes and some small incentives for reskilling and retraining that may not pan out, this is not going to work. So this is going to need the fiscal horsepower of all orders of government. It's going to need fiscal horsepower from the private sector and a lot of ingenuity across the board to really be able to deploy what's going to get us out of this. And the example I look at is from the United States. I remember when President Obama was addressing coal communities, And at the beginning, his rhetoric was really around, you're going to get new skills and new jobs in data fields and technology, et cetera. I look at some of those counties where coal plants were closed down. Many of them had courses that were undersubscribed or had to close down. Many of them who went through the training didn't have the skill sets that were required to actually compete in the tech-driven economy. And then by the end of his tenure, and this is someone I have a great amount of respect for, had to acknowledge that, hey, some of these jobs are not going to come back. That's the kind of level setting and honest brokering we need to have conversations about wage insurance, about fiscal bridges to retirement, about retraining and reskilling, taking from what works and not over-promising things that may not deliver. So maybe my approach is overly humble, but I do think that would be a very bold approach, one that I've not seen deployed in Alberta to be able to navigate what a just transition might look like.
Are there some policies that really step out to or stick out to you that you feel like are kind of a no-brainer for specifically for Calgary?
Yes, fundamentally, I think the two that I briefly mentioned, particularly on the labor side, because we have to keep in mind, as we've dealt with the sustained unemployment and job losses, we're actually now entering a very tight labor market in relation to oil and gas.
Right.
There are shortages on rigs. There's shortages in some of the more traditional industries currently right now. So you have to compete with those that are hiring. And we also have to compete with a little bit of the double whammy of what the primary trade here is in Calgary and Alberta. For engineers, the double whammy for us is that the half-life of an engineer's skills are some of the most rapidly changing of all roles that you could imagine. The half-life, I think, is now around 3 to 3.5 years for the average engineer. And of course, that vacillates on what side of the engineering spectrum you're on. But that's incredibly short shelf life for some of these skills. So I think that the two that I'm most intrigued by, particularly for those that are older workers, are wage insurance and fiscal bridges to retirement. So wage insurance is basically to say, look, for companies and sectors that are really being hard hit by either the public health pandemic or policy changes related to climate, or even just market changes, depending on the temperament or affinity of the government to do so, to be able to offer wage insurance to say, hey, if you're downsized, or I should say, moved to a role within a company that lowers your salary from X amount to Y amount, the government will make up that difference to be able to keep you on the payroll there so that you can keep your job. I have yet to see that meaningfully deployed, and I think that would be a really great way for some of the employers to carry a lot of people forward as we transition versus just cutting them off and putting them onto unemployment, especially because it's very hard to translate some of these skills. Some of them are transferable, but others not. And then the others for folks that are in the later stages of their career, who will not have a great chance at going back to school or not a ton of incentive to get reskilled or upskilled. And by the way, those are things that I believe in. I'm, my background from a research perspective on the doctoral side is around cross-sector partnerships in education and training. I'm a former K-12 teacher, but I also pragmatically realized that someone at 60 years old who had planned to work for the next 5 years may not be so amenable to going back to school and entering into a new workforce. The ability to be able to give them a fiscal bridge to retirement, to see them off, to make sure that they're secure and ensure that they don't end up in fiscal isolation and social isolation, I think are two very, very big low-hanging fruit opportunities we can deploy.
Yeah. Okay. So how much do Calgary's next wave of business leaders see a transition coming, and will they remain here if our city and our province doesn't embrace it? As you know, we are losing young people at a rapid rate from this province, and I think you're in an interesting position there, given your place in having done work with Calgary Economic Development, as well as Global Shapers Calgary, with these young professionals that are looking to the horizon kind of thing. And I guess first of all, how common a thought is it amongst young professionals that, geez, we've got some big changes coming, or we better have big changes coming, or I'm going to bring my family someplace else?
Yeah, and speaking for someone who's sort of in that category, I'm 31 and with a young family. I have not met a serious business leader within my age range that does not see what's coming around the corner, does not recognize the moment that we find ourselves in. And frankly, that's not just specific to sort of next gen young professionals or business leaders. There are many really astounding mentors that I have, many who work in the energy sector or in corporate or nonprofit work, all recognize what's happening right now in this province. So I don't want to put it as sort of these next gen of business leaders are going to be the saviors. All of them recognize it. I think many just disagree on some of the changes going forward. And look, when I served as a director of strategy in 2019 and 2020. I left at the end of the year to take a full year of paternity leave, which I'm in right now, and to finish my doctoral research. But over that period of time, I met business leaders across every sector. I worked hand in glove with many of them to bring investments to the city, to deploy new research, new thinking. The question really is around the statistic you referenced around young people, because it's drawing a lot of attention right now. I do think it's a concern, but it is one that we have to, I think, really pour through the data to understand how we want to respond to it. Young people and interprovincial migration it's always been occurring throughout Calgary and Alberta's history. We've seen an outflow of a ton of people. We've seen an influx of a ton of people. Young people have steadily, in the data that we poured back through while I was leading the research and strategy team at CED, we saw that trend for years and years and years. Where Calgary actually punched above its weight was in bringing people back in their prime working years, in their early 30s, when they wanted to have a family, when they wanted to buy an affordable home, when they wanted a low cost of living. We've always had the ability to pull people back. So I think that, yes, we need to be concerned about young people not necessarily seeing a future in their own backyard. I think any city, any province should be worried about that. But I also think we have to have our eyes, squarely trained towards not losing people who want to start their family, who want to invest the next 15 to 20 years, want to deploy their capital and deploy their tax base here in this province, making sure we're not losing those people as well, because that, I think, will ultimately be a death blow. Not necessarily folks who go around the world, go to take internships in fantastic places across the world, go to school in different jurisdictions, and then come back when they're ready because Calgary and Alberta is home. I think we're only benefiting from them going out and having that experience. I moved here when I was 25 to do my Ph.D. and I didn't know a single person here. Calgary kept me here. So I'm not as concerned about that as some are.
So, being a young business-minded guy and with the experience that you've got, does capitalism as it stand have what it takes to help us, to get us where we got to go on climate crisis? The climate crisis is just such an enormous thing. And, I whenever I speak with a business person about it, I mean, the question that I have is how strong a role can business have in it? And why hasn't it stepped up so far? And, I guess we've had about 20 years to innovate our way out of this thing. And, I wonder about, if the prime motivation is to return investment to a shareholder and not get us to zero as fast as we can, then I feel like we're going to lose that race. How strong a role does business have to have? How much of it has to be government, in your opinion?
It's a really, really good question. And
I ask really good questions, man. I'll tell you.
just throw that plug in there. No, it's a good question. Look, and it's actually one I've wrestled with quite a bit. I think all would agree what we have right now and what we've had is imperfect and is in need of improvement dating back years. There's also a lot of brilliance that's emerged from the system as it stands. And, so for me, in terms of a philosophical camp about capitalism, there's a brilliant economist by the name of Mazzucato who has really talked about reshaping, tweaking capitalism, but still existing within the capitalist framework around redefining value and redefining the traditional levers of how we deploy and create and shape value. And where I'm aligned with her, and there was an event at the University of Calgary several months ago where she presented some of the findings of her new book that are coming out, and I was included on an expert panel to dissect some of these ideas and how they could apply to Alberta. I think you're quite right. The first thing that we need to eliminate from some of the business, political, and investment thinking right now is short-termism. It's not how I think. It's not what's going to get us out of it. It's ultimately what has sort of beleaguered the response to some of the climate crisis and a lot of other investment crises that we've seen over time, is this short-term thinking. All of these challenges that lead to job losses are not the automatic consequence of sort of climate policies that are being made right now. They're the consequence of lagging investment over time, social policies, and like you've said, anticipation, which we've had a good eye on for some time. To your point, though, about what do those tweaks look like? I'm of two minds where that's concerned. One is those tweaks are being made. The question is whether they're correlated and amalgamated into a way where we can grasp our hands on it. For those that believe in a Green New Deal or a just transition or a great reset, or you can insert some of these big movements here, some which are reduced to hashtags, some which are actually really solid policy planks. A lot of what we're seeing is happening right now. It's just not being branded with the banner of being the Green New Deal. The federal budget that has come out over years in subsequent governments of either stripe has always included some measures of energy efficiency, retrofits. They've been extended right now in the most recent budget that's taken a square focused on net zero. But many of those things are what people have been asking for in the climate community for years. When you talk about oil well cleanup, methane gas capture, funding for some of the decarbonization initiatives, even the province over a period of time, and this government and the previous government have done that. It's just not being bundled up in the conversation of a Green New Deal or a just transition. When any sort of climate report that I've read has talked about those being really surefire, safe bets to reduce emissions. So I think we have to recognize what we are doing and maintain those. And then the other side is really adopting, I think, robust ESG frameworks. That is what I've been sort of disheartened by. I haven't seen a lot of the corporate community really tackle those head on. I'm heartened by some of the momentum I see happening now, but I think ultimately we have the opportunity to really get our hands around what an ESG framework looks like and have the corporate leaders in this community hold each other accountable to what that entails across all three of those domains. Practice what we preach, and then we will live up to the expectations and some of the bravado we hold, I think, across the world about Alberta being a place for clean prosperity and good jobs that respect the dignity of people and the environment, for sure, 100%.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that, I also have a chance to plug a partner organization that does some great work is Open Street Events, and the Arusha Center are holding tomorrow night a screening of the new corporation. And that sort of ties into some of my concerns. Is that, well, first of all, I should say it's tomorrow night at 6 p.m. and I think we're going to have a link in the chat here. So anybody wants to go and check that out, it's a screening of that documentary, and you may be familiar with the original The Corporation documentary. This is the sequel, and they will have the directors on hand to answer questions. So it's going to be a great event. But, one of the things that the new corporation identifies is that, corporations, a lot of them still think very much along the lines of it's all about making as much money for that table full of guys, and it's typically white guys and old guys, if it's in North America. And the corporations get good at saying the sorts of things that are going to make people comfortable. But there ends up being, you can call it greenwashing, you can call it whatever you like, but it is something that we have to be vigilant of. And I have a very real fear of Calgary getting left behind. I don't. This is my home. This is where I was born, and I have loved ones here, and I don't want to leave this place. And but there is I have a very real fear of that. And so I'm wondering, do you do you share that concern?
Yes and no. I think that the first thing I think we need to acknowledge is that being in Calgary, in this place, we've caught the brass ring. We're incredibly fortunate and lucky to have the quality of life that we have in one of the greatest countries on earth. And so I'm a little reticent about us being left behind, or comparisons to other jurisdictions and Detroit. We balance our budget. We've got a healthy fiscal sheet. Our health outcomes are largely good. We've got a lot of things to improve. And I've been, even prior to my role at CED, was very outspoken either in, political commentary on television or in community organizing about what we need to improve. We definitely do. But I'm not worried about being left behind solely because of the strength of our people. I had the privilege in leading the economic strategy for Calgary amongst a number of thoughtful stakeholders across business, nonprofits, et cetera, and the ingenuity that I'm seeing, not just within specifically, say, clean tech, where I could point to a lot of things that don't sound like a place that's going to be left behind. $100 million backstop clean resource innovation network. 4 of the most promising clean tech companies on the Narwhal list are in Calgary. I could go down the list across the board of all of the things that we have in our back pocket that people would pine for in their communities. Where I see a challenge is in the lack of vision to tie all of these things together. I'm a fan of big tent politics, big tent community organizing, and I think it's that give and take that we've lost. There's been a hyper-partisan backlash, I think, to some of the isolation feelings within Alberta and Confederation. Some justified, I think some, ginned up and exacerbated for, sort of more devious purposes. I think that's hurt things. We also find ourselves within a macro climate around politics and business that is incredibly black or white or partisan, and that is also challenging. But this is, as my friend Mary Moran says, a very opportunity-rich place to be in. And I just see a ton of people in my circle who I'm privileged to count as friends and colleagues working on incredible things in solar and EVs, even in oil and gas know-how in terms of methane emissions reductions, in carbon utilization and capture and storage. Those are these safe bets, commercially viable, widespread applicable solutions that the rest of the world and this province are going to need. And it's happening here. So it's more for me a concern of rhetoric. It's more a concern of thoughtful policy to avoid some of the whitewashing and things that you've described as highlighted in the documentary that's set to premiere. That's within our control. These are solutions that can be solved. If we get left behind, it's because we haven't taken the right decisions or made the right choices, not because we weren't given a choice or not because we didn't have a decision to be made in front of us, is my 2 cents on the subject.
So hearing you speak reminded me of a thread that I read of yours. I think it might have been a farewell thread to Calgary Economic Development, but you laid out a bunch of really cool businesses doing interesting things. Quite a lot on agriculture as well, and that's another thing where I feel like there's a lot of opportunity. When we talk about a just transition for this province, the standard dichotomy is like, people that are working in oil and gas feel attacked by that, and that's unfortunate, and some of that is probably has to do with how we climate folks bring it up, but I've often felt like there's a number of reasons why Calgary and Alberta could lead the world on these new things. Like it's new stuff. Somebody has to lead it anyways. We have great education systems in here and great education institutions and a vibrant STEM section. And so as far as an Alberta just transition goes, what are some of the technologies that you think there's a chance we could end up being a world leader on? I think about one of the easiest ones I think about, or to me it sounds easy, is where there's an oil well that's been orphaned and is appropriate for geothermal. I mean, we turn that into geothermal, and we should, that should be something that we're not only very good at, but great at. We're great at that stuff. What sorts of things can Albertans be hopeful for in a transition with the natural bounties that we have for us in front of us?
No, absolutely, an astute sort of jumping off point. The thread you're referring to, sort of when I bid my farewell into paternity leave, was really about our city's economic strategy, which I was part of, collectively leading with the community and a number of partners, about making Calgary the destination of choice for the world's best entrepreneurs who want to solve really big challenges in cleaner energy, safe and secure food, the efficient movement of goods and people, and better health solutions. And it was an incredible privilege. And I got the opportunity on social media and pinned to my Twitter profile all of the different announcements, initiatives, successes that happened all across the board, across our established sectors in energy and agribusiness and transportation and logistics, and in emerging sectors like financial services and fintech, all the way through to creative industries and life sciences. So definitely, I think, check that out, because it was a privilege to tell that story before I left. You've pointed on two things. First, this notion of leading the world. I think it's important to note, and this goes back to your previous question around a dichotomy that might exist between some of the, I think, established leaders in the business community and some of the folks that might see it a little bit differently, including myself. There are a ton of people that I respect, that have extensive resumes, know-how, care about this community, who I've been across from in boardrooms, in boards, in community, who have told me, look, we believe that if there's going to be a last barrel of oil that is produced on this planet, it should be in Calgary and Alberta. And they make a compelling argument for why. And I agree with it, largely in terms of environmental protections, democratic governments, all of the things that we know how, almost to rattle off by memory. But I'm not interested in being the last to do anything. Right. I'm interested in being the first to do something. So that's a fundamental difference. So I'm concerned with where we can be the first. And to your point, those technologies are widely deployable across a number of sectors. So I really think that there's a lot that the energy sector would benefit from, across oil and gas all the way to renewables. But that's also something to be wary of. Remember that digitization and artificial intelligence and machine learning are sort of industry or sector agnostic. They will allow energy producers in traditional oil and gas to extract and refine more efficiently, with fewer people, with more profits, et cetera, just the same way that they become more commercially viable on the solar panel side and likewise. So I think that's important to note. But in terms of safe bets and sort of the wildcard bets, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices released an incredible report, I think it was earlier this month. And I think, some of them are the safe bets for what we can do with technology are unsexy. They're electric vehicles, because again, widespread, commercially viable, could be implemented tomorrow. And I
think those are a little sexy. Those are a little bit sexy.
That's true. Right? That's true. A little bit, depending on which EV, I guess. But there was also a statistic today I read from KPMG that said, in a poll of Canadians, 70% of Canadians are planning to make their next vehicle purchase an electric or hybrid vehicle. Right. And of those 70%, 60% of them are planning to make that purchase in the next 3 to 5 years. Now, Atlantic Canada and Alberta certainly lag those numbers, but it's still over 50%. So I think electric vehicles at a consumer level are an incredible opportunity. I think energy efficiency retrofits, particularly within our downtown core, and our industrial sectors is a no-brainer. Carbon capture, storage, particularly on the high concentration side, as well. And then, but we also need some wild cards, and I think that's where the geothermal conversations come up, the hydrogen conversations come up, and even some of the industrial decarbonization and land use stuff. If we have the foresight and the know-how and the thinking to really, walk through what responsible land use planning might be, that might be a wild card to make a dent on emissions as well. But I think there are things we can definitely do tomorrow, bolstered by technology, that will certainly help.
And isn't it incredible that we have the lithium that could go for electric car batteries?
Just
It's
heard,
like
yeah.
this province is a gift. We just need to shepherd it there, I think. So, okay, we're going to go to our panelists shortly, but before I do, I want to say a special thanks to the folks who helped keep the lights on. So on behalf of the electric solar powered lights. On behalf of the Calgary Climate Hub, I'd like to take this moment to recognize the support of the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, whose grant programs have helped bring forward so many great Alberta-specific environmental initiatives, including this broadcast. They're a group of very smart people that care about the right things, and in my humble opinion, they'll only become more and more important to this province as we do look at these transitions that we need to make. I also want to say a few words regarding the Calgary Climate Hub and our upcoming elections, or the upcoming elections in this province. The Hub is a nonpartisan organization, and we are not in the business of telling you who we think you should or should not vote for. We will, however, remind you that in 2021, every election is a climate election, and that it's perfectly reasonable for the people asking for your vote to have an answer when you ask them for their climate plan. You can join the Calgary Climate Hub in making that ask by becoming a member and joining our elections node, a core group of dedicated volunteers seeking to ensure that climate is a part of the debate and on the ballot. So you can check out our chat. In fact, a lot of the things we've talked about today and every show, we try to include the links in the chat so you can get more details if you'd like it. And actually, Jason, you'll dig this. I have a bit of a special announcement to make here before we move on to the panelist section of our show. 1,000 years from now, when people are looking back on the historical timeline for the climate era, one of the names on that timeline will be Dr. Michael E. Mann. In fact, I often say before there was an Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth, there was Michael E. Mann's hockey stick curve, which maybe some of you are familiar of, certainly from the climate world you are. With no shade on Al Gore and the work that he did. I'm in awe of the fact that we have Dr. Mann lined up for our very next Climate of Change broadcast. That will be part of the City of Calgary's Climate Symposium next month. Special thanks and a shout out to Jim Byrne and our great new friends in the Southern Alberta Climate Hub, some of whom might be watching right now. And I'll go out of my way to say welcome. Coalition building is so important, especially in this province amongst common climate minds. So welcome, and let's see what great work we can continue to do together. So that Climate of Change featuring Dr. Michael E. Mann takes place at 6:30 p.m. on Wednesday, March 24th. And you can find the RSVP link in the chat. What do you think of that, Jason? Your follow-up interview, the guy after you is one of the biggest minds in climate history. How about that?
How about that? And maybe I'll not. Maybe I won't reveal this online. But I think that there's a fair likelihood that I will be following him in another venue, in another conversation at an event in the next few weeks as well. So definitely a great get, and look forward to hearing what he has to say.
Right on. Okay, so we have our panelists. I'm going to go, my first panelist I'm going to go to, her name is Lori Farley of Intonovus Canada and Impact Calgary. And she does a lot of great work helping entrepreneurs embed social impact into their business models, which is why I thought she'd be a great panelist for Jason. She and that social impact most certainly includes Sustainable Development Goal number 13, which is climate action. I'm going to embarrass Lori a little bit, maybe, because She's a great and smart lady. If you enjoyed, well, actually, what I'll say is that when I do that second land acknowledgement on behalf of the children and the grandchildren, etc., it was Lori's idea, who came to me one time and said, Steve, why don't you write something up like that? It's just, you should do it. And I've got a lot of praise from a lot of folks all over the place. This is the lady who had the idea, and she's got all sorts of ideas. So Lori, I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, Jason. Congratulations on your new family member. I've been meaning to tell you that for a while, but we don't get to see each other anymore.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for that discussion. So I know that you're really community minded, and I really appreciate that. We're kind of in the same mindset in that space. And when we're talking about the new economy in Alberta, we're often referring to the energy sector or the tech sectors. And as we start talking about balancing and diversifying our economy, we know that everybody has a stake as consumers and business owners. And climate change is a part of a systematic set of issues that needs to be addressed in an integrated way in integrated systems. And, you know, I'm probably referring to this because I'm talking about all the sustainable development goals and how climate change fits into that. So for entrepreneurs that are concerned about climate change, their business is just going to be a part of that whole integrated system. What's your take on some of the questions that entrepreneurs should be asking themselves and business owners, how their businesses can contribute or participate in changing those systems, and how their businesses can contribute to making improvements that are needed in all of those systems to resolve climate change? And I'm referring to all the different kinds of businesses that includes the energy sector and tech sector, but you know, the moccasin lady, the jewelry making lady, the coffee shop. I think that a climate conversation in Alberta needs to consider all the people that have been supporting the energy sector, but not in the energy sector for so many years.
No, it's a great question, and thank you for asking it. Look, it's one that I've you know, spent many a night thinking about as well. You know, we tend to try and have the biggest impact as possible, and you know, over the last couple of years, what I've been trying to balance is, you know, where's the capital being deployed, where are the most amount of employees that we can impact, while also balancing sort of my roots as a sort of community organizer on the ground sort of person. And I think you're quite right that we need to really strike a middle ground, especially when many of the businesses are small businesses that are going to be having to make, you know, a lot of tiny decisions that align themselves to being part of the new economy or a part of the solutions towards some of the impacts of climate change. So I think I have two thoughts. The first is, look, we have a ton of frameworks that can help. I know you've done a lot of work in sort of B Corp space, say sustainable development goals, ESG, but they have to be accessible. If I'm just someone who, like you said, is you know, selling moccasins that are homemade, et cetera, it's hard to, you know, relate to a framework that is being negotiated with member countries from some, you know, macro international organization. How does that impact me? Part of what I've realized is that many of those folks have not been consulted with. So, you know, folks like you at Impact Calgary and other partners that are actually doing the work, working with businesses that have these ideas and showing how it can be accessible is super, super important in making some of those tweaks, because we'd be better off for it. It's the same, it's not something that we haven't done. It's the same way with citizens. I make small tweaks in my lifestyle and impact because I want to, you know, sort of make a difference. Some of those are completely accessible to me because my perspective got changed out of a conversation with someone. And I said, hey, you know what, years ago, I decided to become a vegan. And it's not something that I preach about or talk about, but it's something that I know consciously is definitely making an impact in a very small way to sustainable development for our planet. So I think that's the first. The second is, you know, really looking at what catalytic opportunities exist for growth. We have lacked, I think, a growth mindset to support some of our entrepreneurs that are really thinking about regenerative businesses, the game changers. Our risk tolerance has to change. We are still, as much as we are entrepreneurial, we are still very risk averse. And so what I've tried to champion through the economic strategy, and what I think a ton of companies, small, medium, and large, and otherwise, are what are going to be the game changers, and not losing or watering down some of that ambition. And they're most importantly taking a credible path to get there. if we can highlight more of those stories about those that are aiming for the game changers, not just within Calgary, but around the world, and have a credible path to get there, if we hear more about that, if we align ourselves from an economic strategy perspective to bring those into the fold, those are in creative industries, those are in small business, those are in startups that you're quite familiar with. That is, I think, more of the story we need to hear versus convincing some of the largest employers who are shareholder driven, who don't hold a lot of the decision-making authority to all of a sudden make radical changes. I don't think that that's going to be tenable.
Yeah, and my follow-up question is, I guess that you alluded to it. So I think the energy sector, the shift that we're having through the just transition and other types of ways that the energy sector is moving, you talked about people exiting their jobs. It seems to me that a lot of those people who are transitioning out of the energy sector, either because they lost their job or because they're disheartened or changes are happening that are relevant to them for moving out. But now we have quite a large population of people who have financial resources to start their own businesses. And how do you think that ties into sort of this new economy that we're moving into?
Absolutely a huge tie-in. And again, this is something that we're sort of paying attention to now because there's a very distinct focus on our economy, the sustained downturn, the structural challenge in our energy sector, and the changes being made there. But this has happened through periods of boom and bust all the time, whether you're in an energy sector or commodity-driven economy or not. The amount of people, when I announced publicly that I was leaving my role and taking 2021 off to work on my research and be a full-time dad, the amount of people who called me and said, chatted about the decision that they made to stay home with their kids, but many of them actually made that choice because they'd actually been laid off or they'd left their job. They said they spent some time with their kids. It really allowed them the space to think. And then they went out and started their business or a venture capital firm. And these are people that are incredibly successful today. I think we need to make the skill sets of entrepreneurialism much more accessible. There's a reason why the economic strategy, which I still believe in to this day, I wouldn't have committed my name to it otherwise, has entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurship at the heart of what we need to do. And that's not just, for-profit private enterprise. That's not for profit. That's across all different dimensions. And I think it's important that we recognize, Steve mentioned earlier, the importance of education. We are one of the only provinces in Confederation to have entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurial thinking embedded within our curriculum framework. I don't know how often we adhere to it as closely as we should. So you're doing some of the frontline work on this. A ton of other partners are trying to make this as accessible as possible. But I actually think we're going to rely on it. I see my friend Madison is on the call too. This is the definition of someone who's entrepreneurial and doing great things for her city. So we need more of that and fast for sure.
Thanks for coming on, Lori, and thanks for all the great work you do. It's good to see you. So as Jason was able to spot there, our next panelist is Madison Savelo, who's Chief of Staff for Carbon Upcycling Technologies, doing really interesting and critically important work on converting CO2 into usable consumer products. Really, really neat and interesting stuff. And a relatively new Climate Hub member. We just keep getting all these smart new members in here. It just seems like that's the flow right now, and we want you. So check out calgaryclimatehub.ca and come and join in the fun and the good work. There she is. Thanks for coming on, Madison.
Hi, thanks for having me on. And Jason, it's good to see you. I know the Shapers Hub really misses you, but yeah, good to see you're doing well. I'll just jump into my first question there. I'd love to hear all this talk about Alberta and Calgary being a world leader in the energy transition. And I'm wondering how strong a role should policy and government play in supporting clean tech moving forward? Whether that's, carbon incentives, things like that, grants.
Yeah, it's a good question, and tell everyone in the Shapers Hub, I'll see them very, very soon, actually. As I wade back into some of my community responsibilities. Look, I think government has a critical role to play, but I would say no more than any other a sort of power broker here. Part of the challenge, I think, has been the over-reliance for quite some time on government to be able to solve some of these challenges. And I think once you become either beholden or reliant on some of those government incentives, depending on the nature and scale of your enterprise, the more challenging it can be for innovation and growth. We've seen that play out largely within the tech sector. Now, that being said, the role of government, particularly in Calgary and Alberta, I think is one that should be responsive to the market. You know, what I've dealt with over the last couple of years is advocacy for particular sectors where we just cannot compete because of incentives being offered by other jurisdictions or favorable policies towards sectors or businesses in those sectors. And so that's just pragmatic, you know, business and policy meat and potatoes. That is not ideological about the role of government and all of these other things. That's saying, hey, we have world-class, you know, natural skylines and beautiful scenery in, say, the creative industries for film and television. We have some of the best talented workers, but we have a cap up to 10 million on terms of tax credits on what we can rebate. Most of the decisions about film and television are made by financiers, not by directors, unless your name ends in Spielberg or Scorsese or Iñárritu. And you know what? That's how some of these, you know, productions end up going to these remote locations rather than in Alberta, because the incentive is higher. Or why folks are out of work in Alberta midway through the year and then track on to BC where there's a more favorable incentive. The same thing happens within tech. The same thing happens within climate. Now, very long-winded way of saying the very unique, I think, opportunity for clean tech, in particular, is its alignment with some of the frameworks that we have through the new federal budget, not necessarily through the provincial budget that was released today, which is more stay the course, but in future budget conversations around aligning our incentives to the net zero framework. We now have the guideline. We now have cooperation amongst Canada and the US, which is provides a certain level of certainty, not to double dip on the word certain. But if we don't have thoughtful policies, incentives, or programming that aligns towards that vision, and we see orders of government misaligned for whatever reason, it's not going to be successful. So yes, if we've already committed at a particular level, federally, provincially, and certainly as a city, around a number of features that lead to investments in climate resiliency, support for clean tech innovation, et cetera, it's important that I think the policies, the tax credits, the incentives map towards that, because if not, you're stifling some of the success of that overarching policy. And I don't think, agree or disagree, anyone wants to see previously rolled out funds and programs fall flat on their face just because of government misalignment.
Awesome. No, that's great. The next question I had was, it's very much a change from the rest of this conversation, mostly around, you know, innovation and energy transition, things like that. But I'm really curious to get your thoughts on the 15-minute city model that a lot of cities are trying to take on, and specifically for Calgary, which is such a sprawling city. And I know earlier this year, there was some talk within the city that, you know, voted against expanding the city for 11 new districts. So yeah, just curious about your thoughts on how that can be a portion of tackling climate change as well.
Yeah, no, another great question. Look, I think that the 15-minute city is a compelling model. It's got, you know, thoughtful urbanist practices. When you layer on the concept of donut economics on top of that, it becomes increasingly more compelling. And I'll be paying close attention to Paris and other jurisdictions that are trying to implement it. The challenge with Calgary is we got to dance with the one that brung us, and we have what we have, and what we have is beautiful. What we have is imperfect. What we have is complex. We can't put the toothpaste back in the tube, and I think that's what I said to Bentley earlier around, you know, if we took some very radical approaches to land use planning, maybe we could put a dent in some of this. But the sticky situation we have is, you know, we're largely overbuilt. You know, property tax revenues from downtown have largely funded a lot of the services that we have. We have to get used to a new norm where that's not the case. And then the other one that doesn't get a lot of attention, and I've, you know, publicly spoken out against the investment in the 14 new communities and largely the 11 that were eventually turned down, because I think it's just unsustainable fiscally to be able to do. But the through line that I do empathize with or understand is those communities that are being built on the periphery of the city are being built with some of the most thoughtful urbanist practices, 15-minute city mentality that you could find. They are sticky places. They have mixed use development. They have energy efficiency. The challenge is that they're just keeping people on the periphery of the city. So while in the macroeconomic perspective, it's certainly unsustainable, it's not going to pay for itself. It's growth that upon growth that was not necessarily needed in terms of building out instead of building up. The challenge is that it's being built really well. And I think we have to acknowledge that and not denigrate it. We have to think about the quandary we find ourselves in. And like I said, I stated publicly on the record in the paper and in other forums at the time, I don't think it was a responsible thing to do. I don't think it'll be a responsible thing going forward. I'm heartened that they made different choices, but we really have to take, whether it's under the 15-minute city banner, just take the macro principles from that, or meso principles, if you will, and just apply them. Do we want to have choice and freedom in our city, which might align with the sort of rhetoric in Alberta that might fly anyways, to walk, to shop, to bike, to do all these other things without any other ideological agenda? We just like choice and freedom in the market, and that's how we want to build and encourage people to build. Great. Let's start doing that, particularly within our downtown that I think certainly needs it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Madison, and thanks for the great work you're doing with the Hub.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
You bet. You know what? I've got a question or two left there, Jason. I always try to hone it in at about an hour, but sometimes we go a little bit over. I hope that's okay with you. I know you're a new dad.
Don't worry, he's already fast asleep. So dad's out for the night. He can
All right. Fair enough. Okay, so the other question that I feel like I want to brush on really briefly just is that, we do have an election coming up in Calgary. The Calgary Chamber of Commerce around the tech, when tech decided to pull out of the deal here, expressed wishes for a climate plan. And that was a sort of new as far as my experience from that particular organization. And so I guess my question is, how can we make sure that a transition or a just recovery is on the ballot and in the debate halls? How do we make it so that this is something that people are talking about during this election?
Very simple in my mind, and I think people are going to hate this answer, but I just see no way around it. And it's to have, and I'm not putting pressure on your organization, but I think it's going to be incumbent upon organizations that want to see this on the ballot, or just, concerned citizens, or ones that recognize, both the opportunity and challenges posed by climate change, is to consult. There's no point in putting something on the ballot or cajoling the candidate that you want, so that they hope that they can get in, just to potentially be let down once the complexity of a decision is put upon them. That model of governance is unsustainable. We already have the scars to prove it. If your faith is placed in one single person to make the decision you want at a time years out, particularly in the field of politics, I don't have a lot of faith in that process. So the one thing that people can do is consult, if you're an organization, just like we did when I was curator of Global Shapers Calgary, we partnered with Madison's help and Robin from Global Shapers and a number of others to put on a federal debate. Had all the parties, I believe all the parties, maybe except for one, represented there, and were able to ask thoughtful questions. And I thought it was a very, very productive conversation. The next step has to be not only consulting with the candidates, but consulting with the people that are going to be impacted. The call to action, or the challenge that I have right now, is that when we invoke just transition or just recovery or any of these other things, depending on who you talk to, you get a different answer of what it is or what it looks like or how you define it.
Right.
Are we talking about the UN's approach, which is the just transition mechanism, where they've deployed actual investment capital to be deployed in 3 different streams, geared towards citizens, geared towards the private sector, leveraged with other financing models and orders of government? Or are we talking about rhetoric, which can be, easily weaponized or misinterpreted? It's the same thing that goes for the Green New Deal. I've seen announcement after announcement, and it was part of, it was not necessarily part of my role at Calgary Economic Development or related to the economic strategy, but it was a responsibility that I felt in my chair to communicate to people where all the pieces are fitting together, where all these announcements come up. But if you believe in a Green New Deal and you look at the federal budget and a number of the other announcements that have come, either through the Alberta Eco Trust Foundation, who I know is a sponsor, or another order of government around energy retrofits, clean buildings, a number of other efficiency measures. That's part of what, my understanding is a Green New Deal calls for. I didn't see anyone connecting the dots and say, what a great announcement or what a great deployment of capital to be able to move our city forward or economy forward in terms of a transition or any New Deal. So I think this is the time to get credible. This is the time to get pointed and make sure. And maybe I'm taking the opposite tact of what Meslin, who I've spoken to a couple times in Calgary, said in the last episode, which is, look, the power of hashtags. Yeah, there's power in it, but I don't know when it comes to policy and the actual decisions that improve the lives of people, whether that leads to the outcomes we want. It can certainly get on a ballot. It can certainly get a candidate elected or not. I don't know that it has the efficacy in the actual decisions we need to make right now at a time where we need to get this right. We won't get another do-over. If I don't see something in front of me as a decision maker that's credible, doesn't necessarily need to be totally costed, but at least a framework, I don't know that it's deserving of the kind of attention that we would expect any other senior leader, decision maker, let alone political authority, to go off on or deploy millions of dollars of capital. Now's the time to get really, really credible on consultation and that policy frameworks.
Yeah, I'll put it in the terms of innovation. I think you're right to talk about it the way you do. I feel like we're missing the whole product development. Like we're passing around catchphrases like a just transition, but if I try to explain to my brother or my dad or whomever what exactly that is, I can make the right sounds, but if he wants to pass that to his money guy, I have nothing. And until we have that whole product development, we're not going to get that middle of the curve, right?
Yeah, and I'll say there are choices to be made. It's not esoteric. It's not completely theoretical. Jurisdictions have moved forward with this, and
Yeah.
What I think we need from the community or concerned parties that want to see action on this file is to get a little bit definitive, not overly rigid, but certainly adaptive in saying this is what it could look like and this is what it would include. We've seen the deployment of fiscal capacity at all orders of government, so we know that there's money that has been earmarked to deal with, say, the public health pandemic. That we can forecast what it might cost to do some of these things and which order of government is largely responsible for it or not, and then I think approach elections or the like with I think a level of certainty or at least a framework to have that conversation in, because if you don't, you end up, I think, in the situation you're in with your old man is knowing that you're passionate about it, knowing that you care about it, but not necessarily knowing how to move the wheels forward on the product development side to be able to make it tangible. And just very quickly, the last thing I'll say is we need to remember that there are going to be different signals and perspective shifts that matter to different people. I mentioned to you when we chatted earlier, there are communities in Calgary that for years have measured job growth or job attractiveness by signals of wealth. We still have some of the highest income levels in the entire country, even with sustained unemployment. I have a good friend who's in the business of renewables, great company, making a good amount of money, and he has an electric vehicle, and it's by a brand name car maker. And he says, I park it on the driveway. And I just said, okay. And I just kind of carried on with our conversation. He said, do you want to know why I park it on the driveway? And I said, sure. And he said, because I want people to know there's money in renewables. I want to send a signal across all the people that I know who live in my community that worked in the energy sector and oil and gas, that there's wealth here. And I'm not going to judge that signal that's being sent of saying, hey, maybe that's what changes someone's mind on renewables is the fancy car in the driveway, not, the climate strikes or others that I think, again, are incredibly important. What we need, again, I'll remind you of what I said earlier, a big tent. Big tents are the movements that I'm into. Everything from the strikes that are happening on Fridays, and I know your co-chair has done a lot of great work, and his daughter, and I very, very much admire the commitment to this issue, all the way to some of the more transactional things of, relying on catching that glimpse of that, fancy EV, or, our former Premier Peter Lougheed, who I have a great amount of admiration for, flying over in a helicopter one day and looking out and saying, whoa, we need responsible and sustainable growth development. Maybe if that helicopter ride didn't happen, he wouldn't have spoken out at the time that he did. We need to think of all of these different perspective changers leading towards any election and in the years to come.
Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for coming on, Jason. I really enjoyed our chat tonight. Actually, before I go into my final spiel, is there anything else you'd like to communicate to our audience, or did we cover it?
No, I think we've covered a fair bit. I just want to thank you and the team of the Calgary Climate Hub for the invitation, for the thoughtful questions from Lori and Madison, and to all of the folks that have committed just countless hours of advocacy, of volunteerism, to be able to, I think, wrestle with some of these issues that are in need of discussion. It's been a privilege to chat with you guys today, and look forward to partnering with the Calgary Climate Hub in the future on any initiatives that matter to Calgarians and Albertans. So thank you once again.
We may want you to come in and join us on maybe our elections note or something. Well, I'll reach out to you.
Feel free.
Yeah. Once again, thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. Before we go, I'll reiterate we're immensely grateful for the support of the Alberta Eco Trust for this broadcast. I should say a few words about the Calgary Climate Hub as well. If climate is something that is important to you, is something that you feel, and especially if you've got the smoky skies out there, or you've got anxiety about the future, I urge you, for your own well-being, to find yourself a Calgary Climate Hub. And if you're in Calgary, you've got it right here. There's nothing quite like going and sitting around a table with a bunch of smart people that are looking at legitimately moving the ball on climate at the municipal level, at the community level, and whichever levels we can find. Joan Baez once said that the antidote to despair is action. And, so I would recommend that you join the Calgary Climate Hub. And if you don't have the time, but you've got a few extra bucks, it's a tough dollar, the climate dollar in this city, and it shouldn't be. And we can always use the help. We need the help. So consider donating to the hub, volunteering to the hub. But again, if you care about climate, you want to be a part of this thing. Beyond that, as I mentioned, our next Climate of Change episode, my mind is blown. It's Dr. Michael E. Mann, world famous climate scientist and author. March 24th at 6:30 p.m. RSVP in the chat, calgaryclimatehub.ca. You might want to sign up for that sooner rather than later. Only got so many spots on the Zoom call. I want to thank my producer, Shay Rogers, for all the great work she does. And I also want to thank Jesse Bartlett, who's been populating the chat, Daniela, who has been putting out the word on Twitter and creating graphics and stuff. And there's a bunch of other great folks that help me do this, what I think is important work. So thanks to all of you. And beyond that, I want to thank you, the viewer, for giving us your time tonight and showing up to listen to me and Jason talk about the challenges the city faces. Good night for now, and let's get to work. Thanks again, Jason.